Overwatch 2's new venture into pickable passives and the recent quick play hacked event proved one thing. They're willing to try aggressive new things for a large population over and over again, and we're likely to see more of these moving forward. Regardless of your stance on whether pickable passives were good for quick play hacked or not, I think we can all appreciate the fact that the Overwatch 2 development team has been very aggressive with trying out and reverting many of these things. Now, my stance on pickable passives is going to be made very clear throughout this video. We're going to go over each one in detail and just the general concepts of passives as a whole. I made a recent video on passives, and we're going to be readdressing some of those points as well as some of the new points raised and the most recent changes. Now, before I do that though, I want to give a couple disclaimers. 3 things. Number 1, change is hated. We don't like change. And so that's just a part of human bias that's going to be played into my review, and I'm just going to have to go and give that disclaimer right now. Number 2, we don't really want to take this one too seriously. I'm treating this one like it's actually going into the base game here, but obviously this is just an aggressive test. This is not the first test that they've done, and it's not the first test that they've discarded. We've had ones with faster spawn times, faster moving payload, and they've included aspects of them, but not really included the whole package. So I'm treating it seriously, but honestly, this was just a fun change. It doesn't have to be analyzed too seriously. But I do want to give feedback that's appropriate for the topic that we're trying to learn from. And finally, number 3, I gave this one around 4 to 5 hours of testing over 2 days, which is really not enough to get a full, complete read of whether it's good and whether it's bad. So there's going to be some obvious holes in my testing, some things that maybe I needed to test more further, but honestly just didn't get the capability to do so. So keep that in mind. Overall here, I don't want to rehash my previous video, but I do want to touch on my 3 problems with passive super fast. Number 1, it's free value. It doesn't feel good to get value out of passive. It's just there. It's not a choice or a cooldown or a skill or a mechanic that I can really leverage most of the time. Number 2, it's painted with a broad brush. Obviously that one was a little bit better this time around because a lot of those passives were pickable. There were 3 passives that you could choose for each role, which was awesome, but we still had a lot of heroes that benefited a lot from the passives and heroes that didn't benefit at all from those passives. More on that a little bit later. And number 3, and maybe one of the more important ones, is the optics. Overwatch can be a very confusing game, but it's generally a visually consistent game. With the pickable passives, it got to be very difficult to know exactly what my teammates were running, what the enemy team was running, and that was a problem because that definitely changed how I would have approached a lot of engagements as a tank, DPS, or even changed how I play as a support. It's really important with optical clarity that we're able to consistently showcase these things in action, and I have a lot of misgivings about this being done in the base game. We already had a big issue with the DPS passive visibility, and that's just one passive. We introduced 9 passives into the game here now, and I don't know how they'd be visually consistently communicated, and that's a little bit concerning. So the question is why were pickable passives utilized? In a recent interview with Alec Dawson, he talks a lot about how he wished he had more balanced knobs to tweak and to turn when trying new things in the game. Not just to balance things better, for things to feel new and fun. But I think Alec Dawson also brought up an interesting point in that exact same interview when he said some of the Sojourn changes with moving some of her value away from rail into her primary fire gave them more knobs to turn. And they did that with her kit. And honestly, I wish they'd do that more. I don't love the whole concept of passives. I wish that we had issues with hero problems or even role problems that we'd address it on a hero by hero, kit by kit basis instead of large passive solutions. And while more fun systems can definitely be exciting in the short term, generally over the long run, they start to feel a little bit more gimmicky and people generally get bored and want to go back and just play the original good old Overwatch. They have to be walking very carefully with this change. From here, we're going to get into the pros and cons of each passive. I really don't want to get bogged down with the details of which role benefited the most. I want to just focus on each role and individuality, along with a conclusion of some examples of how passives have been utilized in other games that I play to relatively high success. Let's get started. We'll start off with Unyielding, which was the duration of debuffs reduced by 40%. And I found this one situationally useful. I think a lot of people saw this and thought, oh, it's going to be so OP, super, super powerful, super nice. But one thing that this thing does not do, it doesn't really affect a lot of boops as much, at least that I could test. There wasn't a lot of communication about which debuffs were effective. I definitely noticed it reduced anti-nade and all crowd control duration, but I don't know that it actually reduced boops. Now, regardless of whether it reduces boops or not, it still disrupts your engages. If I'm playing Winston or Wrecking Ball, anything that wants to engage at any point in time, the duration of the debuff may not be the biggest issue, it's the CC that happens anyway. A Wrecking Ball may not be booped or slept for as long, but the sleep still ruins the engage. The whip shot from the Brigitte still ruins the engage. The hack, even if it doesn't last as long, still ruins the engage. So this one is useful for sure, but for many characters like Roadhog, they don't really have to engage, and it might be a little bit broken because he can just tank through so much more now. And characters like Winston, whose displacement really ruins the engage, or the timing of their CDs ruins the engage, the CC will still be effective at making the Wrecking Ball feel bad. So while this one felt like a net buff, maybe almost too powerful of a net buff for certain characters, it didn't feel as useful for others. And again, free value. To be very clear, this does not solve the CC problem, the focus problem of the format of 5v5 solo tank, especially for certain tanks. This is a band-aid solution. It might feel good for some characters, but it does not fix the root issues. Now, it may not be intended to fix those root issues, but I want to make sure that that's very clear. Number 2 was Armored, converting 100 health into armor. There's really not a whole lot to say about this. It's more tankiness. The unique thing with this is that now that armor functions a little bit more effectively versus bulleted characters like Bastion and Reaper, there are situations where you could actually make this swap into counter comps if you're struggling versus those characters. I find that one relatively useful, but just free mitigation doesn't really change how you do things and doesn't really add any interesting new level of nuance. The counter swap sort of things does make it a little bit better. That's one nice thing. And finally for tank, Last Stand. This is the one that everyone's talking about. 50% cooldown reduction when below 50% HP. And there's some obvious winners for this one. Playing one game with Zarya immediately showcased that you can let yourself drop to around half HP and just basically get your bubbles back infinitely more. Now the key thing here is breakpoints. It's not just, oh, I get a cooldown back faster, but you get the cooldown more times in a fight than you would otherwise. And based off of that metric, I actually found it more useful for Winston than a lot of the other tank characters, because with Winston, I would often drop below half on an engage using jump, using bubble. But because I would drop below half, I would guarantee myself the ability to jump out of many engages that I otherwise would not have been able to jump out on. And not just that, but because I spent a few seconds below 50% HP, even disengaged, I actually regenerated my bubble back 2 or 3 seconds faster than normal, which meant I could go for my next cycle even faster. Zarya is an obvious winner here, but Winston, Doomfist, there's a lot of tanks here that are going to get that second cooldown cycle. Even Ramantra with his shield and vortex cooldowns, they're going to get that cooldown a little bit faster. That's going to allow faster cycles. This one was useful, definitely a little bit top heavy with other tanks. I enjoyed playing with certain tanks, not something I'd really want to see in the base game. It seems a little bit unintuitive to play around a lower HP. HP management is part of a skill of a tank, and this one seems to reward almost a lack of HP management. It does add another choice, but it does so in an unintuitive fashion. Next, we'll move on to damage, and damage largely had the most disappointing ones that were either not particularly interesting or not particularly useful. Number 1 was Slayer. Basically, like Sombra, you can see critical health enemies through walls. This was taken away from Sombra, and it's something that was situationally useful, but I had a really, really hard time finding ways to incorporate it into the game. The best value I found of it was playing a flanker and essentially having more consistent time in actually beating that one-on-one, because I could see basically them through walls, so I get the Zen to low, and it basically prevented him from getting the right click off or the sleep dart off in the Ana. It just felt situationally useful, but not particularly useful, and didn't change how I played all that much. And it was honestly frustrating to play versus this one as well, because it felt like it gave an unfair advantage to a flanker, just getting me to critical. It was also so rarely useful. Only once a game sometimes would it actually kick into play and change how I take an engagement. So it was not only annoying to play versus, not particularly useful to play as, and very rarely useful. Not a big fan of this one. Number 2 is Trigger Happy. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say for this one. Obviously, it doesn't help Hanzo all that much. And actually, there's a lot of characters that it wasn't super useful for. Characters like Widowmaker, where it's like, okay, the reload thing is not as big with Widowmaker. Even Sombra, where immediately I was like, oh, Sombra's going to have a massive clip. But a lot of times the way I play Sombra, more assassin, backline harassment, I rarely got my full clip off anyway. I found it more consistently useful for Tracer, Soldier, anything where I'm consistently emptying my clip. Even a character like Cassidy gets that one extra bullet. This one is definitely useful. It's definitely good. It just wasn't super, super fun in terms of how it was played. And again, definitely top heavy in terms of who it affected. And finally, for damage, we have Frenzy. Now, this one was definitely the most frustrating one, and on paper sounds very exciting, a brief speed boost after elimination, but ironically, we need to learn our lessons from the last time that this was incorporated. You see, this was very similar to the original DPS passive at the start of Overwatch 2, and frankly, it was very top-heavy. Shocker, affected characters like Genji more than a lot of other characters, and also it required you actually get an elimination. This is what I like to call a snowball passive, where it actually doesn't really provide much of a benefit at all. It really provides no benefit at all until the fight is already in your favor. So you get the elimination, that's great, but if you get the elimination in Overwatch 2, you're already at a significant advantage anyway. This just kind of guarantees that. So this is a great passive to secure 4Ks and 5Ks, but it may not help you win as many fights as something like a little bit more ammo. One thing I did notice, which may be unintended with this, is that breaking destructibles like a turret, symmetric teleport, and so on, gave you the passive. I don't know if this was intended or not. It definitely added a little bit more nuance to the engagement because I could actually proc it consistently, but still felt inconsistent enough to where I didn't feel a lot of fun out of it until I got those big 4Ks and 5Ks. It's a highlight farmer, and that's about it. And finally, we're going to move on to support here. So Resourceful, reducing cooldowns by 20%. I mean, it goes without saying, this is really, really, really strong. And going back to the tank passives, it's more of a breakpoint question. When are you going to be able to get 2 of those cooldowns when otherwise you get 1? Or 3 when otherwise you get 2? The obvious answer here is something like an Ana, where I was able to get consistently 2 anti-nades in fights and otherwise would only get 1. Sleep Dart a little bit less so. Still only want to be using Sleep Dart once per fight. You can't really force that cooldown. But then there's a lot of other characters that have lower cooldowns, like Kiriko and Moira, which just felt like I didn't have any cooldowns at all. Particularly hilarious was playing a new Junk City on Moira, and I just felt like I literally never had any sort of downtime whatsoever. I always had Fade. I always had Orb. This is especially useful for those characters like Moira, where using her cooldowns consistently over and over and over again is going to reap a lot of those rewards. Baptiste, I definitely felt like I could have gotten 2 regenerative bursts and maybe even 2 lamps, but I wasn't really looking for ways to force that cooldown value as much as I would like a damage orb, and so I wasn't getting as much consistent value out of it. Brigitte with armor pack as well, very useful with this here, and obviously doesn't really help a character like Zenyatta. This one felt, frankly, just really, really strong in the wrong hands, and I wasn't as big of a fan of it. It felt like a lot of free value. It just felt kind of silly in some circumstances. Again, it's just free value. You know, it's kind of hard to not let my general opinion of passives bleed into this one overall. Next up, we have Swift Save. This increases healing by 50% for targets that are below 35% HP. So basically, critical targets are going to be healed for a significant more. I played this one a little bit with a couple of characters, not as much as I would have liked to. I definitely noticed it with the Brigitte armor pack. So you have that burst heal off the armor pack, and now you're increasing that burst heal by 50% more, and then even more after that. You definitely notice it, how game-breaking it is. It's going to be more of a clip farmer. I don't think this one is as useful consistently as some of the other ones, but it's definitely going to be providing more of those Twitter rage bait clips where something is 1 HP and just gets healed all the way back to full. It's going to be from things like this. You could see this with Baptiste regenerative burst off the initial burst heal. It's going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot of situations where this one would be useful, and it is a big sustain creep because it's going to be a lot harder to finish off targets when there's any sort of burst healing around. Again, you know, you guys can probably guess my opinion on this one overall, but I want to give it its fair assessment. And finally, Close Call. This one is you gain a brief 20% speed boost when below 50% HP. And I kind of like this one too. I actually threw this one on Zen, and there's a lot of times when I was getting pressured or dove or dueled, and it allowed me to disengage or create more space between me and my target. And it's fairly useful, fun little one here. Again, all I can picture in my brain though is that how many times this is going to deny the ability to finish the kill on targets that are low. And we already have that problem enough as it is with support CDs and support heroes as they are. One fun interaction here on paper was incorporating this with more of a Reddit Lucio playstyle, and I really tried to make this work. Unfortunately, speed boost in Overwatch 2 is additive, it's not multiplicative, which it makes sense from a balance standpoint, but the 20% speed boost added onto Lucio's amp speed, Lucio's normal speed, it's not as much as you'd notice. It definitely helps a little bit, but it doesn't provide as this crazy Lucio goes flying when he gets low, it's not as useful. I could see this also being useful for flanking DPS Moiras as well, to prevent them from consistently being locked down. Again, this is going to have a lot of frustrating ramifications about the characters that we're playing for. It seems very difficult to find a balance of support between this character is unkillable versus this character is doing too much damage. I think that these passives don't really address some of those issues and don't really provide as much playmaking opportunities without kind of breaking the table. So overall, my opinion of pickable passives is pretty much the same with base game passives. I'm just not as much of a fan. They're not particularly fine-tuned to character, it's free value, and many of them are extremely useful for all the characters in the role. Moira really benefits from all of them, and some just don't feel particularly useful for any of them. Hanzo doesn't benefit from any of them at all. Now, obviously, this is just a test. A lot of these would be continued to tweak if they were incorporated into base game, but frankly, I just don't know that I want them to be. You see, I play a lot of other games, and they have different ways of incorporating passives, but most of them are either totally individualistic or creative. I'm gonna get a little nerdy for a second, so bear with me. One of these games is War of the Ring, a board game I really enjoy playing, where you have different guides for the Fellowship, Gandalf, Aragorn, Gollum, and so on, and they all have passive things that help you to move the Fellowship, but they're all specific to the character in a way that actually makes you feel like you're playing the character. They're unique to the character is the key unique thing here. A similar concept is also used in a board game I could play called Spirit Island, where every spirit that you're playing has a unique bonus that changes how the base game is played, but it's consistent for the character and it's only that character. I play another board game called Dominion that incorporates something similar where it's more global passives called events and ways. But the way this is balanced is that both teams can choose to take part of the passives, can choose to buy or use those concepts or use those actions whenever they'd like to. And again, they're very visible and there's only a few. So it's a lot less complicated about how it's actually being applied. You just pick and choose which passive you want to use for the game that you're playing, and then either side can choose to use it whenever they want to. It's much more consistent and much more visibly consistent with what's going on in the field. And finally, I don't have any footage of this because I haven't played it any recently, but I used to play a game called Lord of the Rings online, and the way that they utilized passives was they would actually have passives which would affect your base stats, and there were a lot of unique ones for each character that you could choose. Now, this had a lot of the base problems of Overwatch, where it could lead to a lot of inconsistency with engagements because you pick a specific passive or build, roll out, and run into the wrong enemy that would just destroy you. But at least one thing that Lord of the Rings Online did well that this one might be difficult with is it was a lot easier to see what passive you were playing into, because under the UI, you could see the loadout that they were running. I just don't know if Overwatch would be able to reasonably find a way to incorporate that system into the game. So what now? Frankly, as I've already mentioned, I don't want to see any of these passives incorporated into the base game. I appreciate the attempt. I like that we're trying new things, but I would prefer more hero-specific changes or hero-specific passives that we could tweak it and change depending on the needs of the character moving forward. I don't like painting with a broad brush. I know that passives are something utilized in some other games, board games, as I mentioned earlier, as well as some other RPGs, but it's a very dangerous line to tread, especially when you're operating in a team-based shooter game. We have to be very careful of genre confusion. I feel like this is something that was not learned from the Overwatch 1 development team, even going back to Jeff Kaplan, who really wanted to force that role-playing RPG feel into a MOBA-based shooter, and it just didn't work. A lot of things sound cool on paper, incorporating some of the PvE talent tree stuff in the base game, but they just don't frankly work for a balanced and quality PvP experience. Now that's just my opinion. I'm glad that developers are trying new things. I don't envy them trying to keep the game fresh and yet not breaking the game. It's a very impossible balance to try. And so what do you guys think? Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.